You are good to go and you're in the official public meeting space.
Good morning. My name is Dr. Elizabeth Ulmer, Chair of the Board of Accountancy Pipeline Committee. I'm calling this public meeting to order. Today is Friday, September 20th, 2024, and the time is 11:02 a.m. This meeting is being held via Zoom video and it is being recorded. Be sure to mute your mic through Zoom. When you want to speak, please use the raise your hand or use your hand feature and unmute when called upon and mute yourself when done speaking. Committee members, the board liaison and support staff can ask to speak at any time. For any members of the public observing this meeting, please use the public comment opportunity the committee will extend at each meeting unless specifically called upon. If you have public comment, please limit it to the topic of the committee's work. Please do not use the chat room for any discussions. Should any technical issues arise, we will pause the meeting until they are resolved. I will now take roll call of members and guests, and I will just do these on my screen. Chris Stalvig.
For the record, Chris Stalvig raises the hand. So just so we can make sure that we have something on the audio recording.
Okay.
Meeting presence.
Just answer present. Logan? Oh wait, you're not member. Yes, or you are member. You're liaison. So yes, you're
board liaison. Yes, thank you.
Yes.
And Logan Steele. Yep.
Claire?
Claire Costin, present.
Mark?
Here.
And so that's Mark. Mark, I always say your name wrong. Is it Medema?
Longy, Miedema.
Miedema. Okay, thank you. Cynthia?
Present.
Cynthia Killingsworth? So Mary Savage?
Here.
All right, and from staff, we have Andrew. Oh, I apologize. I forgot the folks in the room. I forgot as well. Scott?
Present in the office.
Scott, right. Okay, so now we have Andrew.
Present by Zoom and in board office.
Andrew Barlow. For guests, we have Tana Hollis.
I'm here.
And Sherry McPherson.
Present in the room.
And we have our executive director as well.
Martin Biccioni present in the room, and we have one staff person here. I don't know if you can see her on camera, but.
Barely, yes. Hi, Erica. Okay, I think I got everybody.
Okay.
All right, so jumping into our agenda for today, we need to sort of start fleshing out the big pieces of what our goals are and how we are going to really measure what it is that we're doing here, as well as going through the contract. So that's our day.
Elizabeth, I'm sorry. We need to do a formal review and adoption of the agenda before we can jump into our agenda item.
I just realized I didn't have the draft in front of me, and so I was working off the top of my head, which is never a good thing.
I make a motion to adopt the agenda as presented.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
All right, thank you. Sorry about that. So we have a public comment session next. Are there any comments from the public before we move into a work? Oh, I'm sorry, review and adoption. We got that, sorry. Public comment. Do we have any public comments before we move forward into our work session?
Do we have any guests that have shown up? Nope. Okay. Elizabeth, may I recommend on the work session piece that we defer item 4A so that we can move back to the goals discussion right away?
That would be great. Thank you. Yes, let's do that. Okay, so I think before we actually try, I think we're going to have to do this a little bit circular today. Mark had posed a question to Martin based on some conversations at U of O. And I'm going to go ahead, Mark, and I'm going to summarize the gist of what I heard. So please, if I've missed something significant, please let me know. He spoke informally with U of O's leadership, and they had conveyed that they are bursting at the seams in their classes and are not sure that they would, under the current resource situation, be able to absorb more students. Is that a fair characterization?
Actually, Chair, that was Scott Wright, not Mark. That
I'm
passed that
sorry.
information.
Yes, I'm sorry. You're right, Scott. Apologies.
So Mark, you're not on the spot of going, what the heck is she talking about?
Yeah,
So-
no wonder.
Correct. I was at a meeting of what they call the accounting circle, where there was an update provided of the program. They indicated seats in the undergrads were at near an all-time high, certainly in the last 5 to 6 years. And they made the comment, and my recollection was bursting at the seams trying to service that many people. I followed up with an unofficial, off-the-cuff, ad hoc follow-up based on the idea that we're trying to put more people into seats in the accounting program, and ask if there was a 10% increase, just using that as a guide, so about 40 students, could they readily absorb that with their current resources? And the answer back was more or less no, not really, that they weren't there yet. And then I followed up further then with, well, how long would it take to get the resources from both the College of Business College and from the university itself to get teaching positions, classrooms, all the other educational resources necessary? And the comment was, could be 2 to 3 years. Now, if they knew that there was something legislatively in place that approved this and it was going to happen, they might be able to get started on it sooner. But they really couldn't start on anything until it felt like it was a sure thing that they would be seeing this surge of 10%. So I presented it back as I don't know where it stands on other universities. I have heard anecdotally that Oregon State is really high in accounting seats right now. I don't know what their ability is to shift around, but I don't want us to I want us to have a conversation of whether we're trying to shove 10 pounds into a 5-pound sack, that they just can't absorb the numbers that we want to see. Or if it does take that long, keep in mind that this could be a 10-year process. It's going to take us 2 years perhaps to get this funded, 2 years for them then to accept the students, and then students having 4 to 5 years to get out of the program. It's 10 years down the road before there could be a possibility of seeing meaningful movement. If that's what it is, that's great. I fully support all this, but I just wanted to have that discussion in public and find out from the other universities and institutions, is this common, or is it a high grade problem that the University of Oregon has?
Logan, I'm going to call on you because I saw you shake your head, and I suspect that you and I have similar views on this. But if you could speak for Oregon State, I know that you've seen also. So just as a general comment, what we see in Oregon is that Oregon and Oregon State tend to have higher enrollments during good economic times, whereas PSU and the community colleges tend to be countercyclical, because students return to school, or the traditional age students, because of financial reasons, parents lost a job, they live at home, and students who would only be moving away when they can afford it will instead go to PCC and PSU. So there's that piece of it as well. I'm actually going to call on Mary first, because she may have some more to add from a University of Oregon perspective, but I want to just, maybe you also have the answer to 2 other things that I didn't get. Well, Mary, maybe I'll just go ahead and share your perspective. And then I think Logan's also in a great position here.
I know that we are busy, and, I've got an overload class, and all my 211 sections are full. And the minor program is increasing. However, I do know they're also focused on hiring, not just tenure track, but also, I want to say Trisha Duncan is joining in fall or winter, and Fritz Duncan has picked up some classes. And so they're looking at tenure track and adjunct instructors as well. I'm also part of a committee that is doing outreach in the community and trying to further bring in more accounting students. So the University of Oregon is making efforts to bring more accounting students in. Now, you're right, Scott, it takes time. It takes time to build all this. But we're seeing the addition of more classes and more sections as we have availability. And I think they're moving towards that, but it could take 2 to 3 years to get there. So I know the university is addressing that issue actively. I don't know who you spoke to specifically, but I know that, I'm part of this committee that's doing outreach to get more students in.
Logan?
Yeah, the timeline for reacting to increase in enrollments, it seems a little long in that discussion, this idea of 2 or 3 years. We've been able to react within a matter of months to surprises in enrollments. And there's a lot of tools we can leverage for short-term enrollment changes, such as adjunct faculty. We are hiring two new positions for this fall 2025 start. So I would estimate our reaction time for like setting in permanent structures to handle higher enrollment is just a year. Right. And even if it were true, let's accept what UO, what someone at UO said as truth, right? I don't know if it has much bearing on the direction that we take, because we're talking about one school, one section of students being the delta there, right? And I don't think that's enough to really move the needle on what we do as a committee.
And for that point, I just wanted to make sure it wasn't something more systemic throughout the higher education system. Granted, my focus, what I heard was simply the U of O, but I just wanted to make sure that there was a more robust discussion. Is it a high grade problem the U of O has, or is it a problem somebody else, others have? So it's good to hear the other perspectives. Absolutely good.
So Claire and Cynthia, I'd like to hear from you too.
So I would just speak for private schools, which is that I don't know a single private school, like in the area or broader country that is not actively trying to recruit more students and struggling to recruit students. The business schools first-time student population increased at a higher rate than the universities for this current cohort, but we still have capacity. We will make capacity. I have taught overloads. Other colleagues have taught overloads. And I think private schools just want more students generally. So I don't think there's a single private school that would say, we can't handle it. And then if there's, if it necessitates hiring, we had a search that we had to do this past spring and managed to hire somebody in a very short period of time. So I know we'll adapt also. So no complaints over here from the private schools.
And the academic market is really difficult right now if you're trying to find a new full-time faculty position. And so it is, and that will not change for the foreseeable future, because we were pumping out a ton of accounting PhDs, and most of them now are going overseas. So there is a huge, it is relatively easy to fill positions, as Claire just said. I hope that means you were really happy with your hire, Claire. Cynthia?
Well, I think we are optimistic at Portland Community College. Our numbers are up. We're meeting our objectives that we had set. So I think everyone is feeling pretty good, but they're not going through the roof. And we also feel like we can accommodate and we can pivot pretty well. We have in the past, and I think we're probably in a better shape now than we used to be. So that being said, I think everything looks good, but nothing looks crazy. The other thing is just understanding who are the students that we have. And if one of the big goals of this committee is equitable access to the profession, that still remains a steep uphill work for us. And we recognize that at Portland Community College. So I think even if we are seeing really large numbers coming in freshman classes at university, I think we're still not getting to what we need in the variety of students that we have entering the profession.
So I want to just add on, I did a little digging and played with some back of the envelope numbers on this because my reaction to was that was really similar to what everybody said, is we can scale up quite easily. I mean, without getting too deep in the weeds, Yes, we have to maintain certain percentages of doctorally qualified versus non-doctorally qualified, but the reality is you only have to hit that for your measurement year for AACSB. So, and that's only every 5, soon to be 6 years. So there's a lot of, Logan's laughing. I know there's some intermediate thing in there, but I'm passing accreditation off to someone else in my department after this year. Yeah, exactly, Logan. So I do think that I understand that there are some concerns when you're already struggling to staff, but and particularly at a school that has a very high research focus like U of O. The rest of the schools, I think, have probably are able to be a bit more nimble because of flexibility on their faculty, because the faculty are facing different incentives. As Claire said, you know, they just did some overloads. I just boosted up my online classes because we're actually up quite a bit in our intermediate 1 this year. We think that, Cynthia, finally the community college increase has started flowing through. But the thing that I wanted to share that I want to take us back to that really is a segue into then our goals as well is that, you know, we've talked about this with the goal to diversify the profession. We use that phrase very broadly. And we've said that we're going to be suggesting that we're going to be starting on financial need. Well, the easiest way to measure financial need in an objective fashion is Pell Grant. We recognize not everybody, that doesn't capture all of it, but I pulled the Pell Grant numbers by school, by university, and I'll read those to you because I think it's really important that we understand what those are. So Oregon State, and this is across the school, the university, not for a business school or accounting. Oregon State is 22%, University of Oregon 23%, Southern Oregon 36%, PSU 40%, PCC 31%, and UP 17%. So these are this really says something to you. So I just said, what happens if we do, say, take half of this and say we're going to spend half of it, even in the first year, which I think is wildly aggressive, right? So if we did that and we said $5,000 per student, and you can pick any number you want, that gives us 100 scholarships that first year. If you were to spread those over the schools, that's not a very large number, especially if you're looking at it in proportion to the Pell Grant eligible students. So what I did not know, and maybe Mary, you can answer this, how many students are graduated, how many accounting majors graduated from U of O? I don't have a good sense of what your numbers are anymore. Logan,
I don't have a good sense of that either. I can find out real quick.
Okay. Logan, what is your number?
I'd say 80 is a good number right now. It'll probably be higher soon.
That's what I thought. Is you guys
UO, I did look at the data pretty recently for UO, and they have about 30 max students graduating every year, maybe 35.
Okay.
And then they have 250 undergrad students in total. So they're probably graduating 60.
At the accounting circle, they said it was 368 undergrad and 17 MAC.
No, that's not graduates. That's a number across all 4 years.
That's a total cohort. Yes, correct. That's a total group.
Yeah.
368 total and 17 in the MAC.
Yeah, the number that really has the biggest impact, again, I'm probably getting a little nerdy here for the non-academics, but the number that has the biggest impact when you're looking at staffing is actually your graduates, because you can look, that's what you're going to need. In terms of capacity, that gives you a sense of how much capacity you need on those 300 level classes. The 200 level classes are extremely easy to scale up because you're using a variable cost of an adjunct. You're not using a fixed cost there. And again, that all flows into the accreditation issues. So, so that just as a sense for folks, I just want to share the rest of my statistics because I think these are really great for us to keep in mind. So I'm going to read you 2 numbers for each school. The first number is the percentage of students who are white. The second is the percentage of students who are underrepresented minorities, which is Hispanic, Black, Pacific Island, Native American, Native Alaskan. Okay. So white, so for OSU, 63% and 15%. U of O, 62% and 18%. So your difference is Asian students, so which are not underrepresented, considered underrepresented minorities. Southern is 55% and 16%. PSU is 49% and 28%. PSU is 50% and 30%. UP is 45% and 19%. So UP seems to have the largest Asian population, which I think is consistent with what I had heard. So I share those percentages, and I'm happy if folks want them, I can have those sent to you. Just took me a few minutes because I knew where to pull them quickly. They can be hard to find. I think that's really useful for us to understand because because it ties into our goals, trying to get not just more people into the profession, but more diversity into the profession. And we have couched that as both economic and racial, although proxying that with economic. Questions on that? I just thought that was helpful background. Mark, Scott, I want to circle back to you. I don't know why I'm confusing the two of you today. My apologies. Scott, I just wanted to circle back to you. Do you feel like this has addressed your questions that you had?
Yeah, no, I don't know that the only question was there similar issues with the other higher education institutions? It sounds like the answer is no. So that's fine. Like I said, I just didn't want us to get ahead of the cart and say, we're going to push an extra 100 to 150 people into the pipeline every year for the next 3 to 5 years, and there's no place for them to go. If we're limiting it to U of O or Oregon students going to Oregon institutions, you know, and it sounds like for the most part, Oregon is not seeing the same trend lines that some of the other states are, as far as enrollments, gross enrollments at county. So that I think all my concerns have been answered based on the answers I've heard back. So, but I just wanted to make sure it was a part of a public discussion is, okay, let's make sure we really are going to accomplish what we want, that there is a place for these folks to go when they get scholarships.
And Elizabeth, if I may just very briefly add, before we move off of that topic, I also don't want the committee to lose track of the fact this was a really helpful discussion, but it was a discussion on just one aspect of the issue, which is essentially how many more essentially new people we're trying to get into the pipeline. I don't want to lose track of the fact that part of what we're trying to accomplish is also to intervene with helping people not drop out of the pipeline. And so there's kind of different buckets here. And right now we had a really good discussion, but it was about one part of the bucket.
Great. So if there is, and I'm sorry, I should have dropped my dog at daycare today. He's been really good lately, and today he's feeling, somebody must be working in the neighborhood. Excuse me, 1 second. All right. So we had talked about our goals here, and I think I'd just like to open that up again then to everybody. And I thought I'd throw out sort of the laundry list of things that we've talked about. Actually, I'm going to get my dog kicked outside first. All right. And I'm going to just go ahead and am I allowed to do this, Martin, and just pause for a moment?
Absolutely.
Of course he stops, right? Okay, there we go. So I went back through our notes and my notes, and I wanted to just remind everyone of the things that we have talked about. We've obviously said we want to increase the supply. We want to increase the diversity. But some other things that we have talked about sort of tangentially is that we want to reduce the cost burden on students, notwithstanding all these changes that we're talking about. With the potential licensure changes. When we started on this pipeline committee, we were still concerned about the cost associated with a 5th year. And, you know, it's hard to know, you know, we sort of need to just keep moving forward with our committee, irrespective of what's happening at a state and national level related to that 5th year. But there's still a very relatively high cost burden associated with education, whether or not you have to do that 5th year. And in many markets, honestly, not so much Oregon, but in many markets, public accounting is a lower starting salary than other alternatives for these accounting majors. That's true in most of the major cities around the US. And it's just kind of as evidence of that cost burden. I don't know if any of you remember seeing, but back in 2023, PwC rolled out a program of loan forgiveness for their staff. that they would provide them with a benefit of up to $1,200 a year for, I think $1,200 a year for up to 5 years. I believe that's what it was, but don't quote me on the actual number of years. And they did that as a retention tool. I don't know what the specifics were of that, but I imagine there were years worked associated with that they were trying to keep people longer. That was a way to both compensate them more and also keep them in the firm. And I can tell you in my experience, and my guess is some of the faculty see this as well, is we hear, and I hear this from my husband with his firm, is, people jump after 2 or 3 years because they can make so much more money. And a lot of times they have a huge college debt associated with in their budget. And that's part of the reason why they're jumping. So I know that's really hard to measure. And the last thing I did want to just mention, and I think this goes back to some of the concerns you've had, Scott, is that, we've talked about this as a thing of increasing our funnel. So trying to get more people into accounting, because it's very hard to say, oh, we're just going to have this for people who are going to become CPAs. And that does matter, though, to CPAs. And, we're hearing reports of companies that have internal control problems that are getting adverse 404 opinions, internal control audits, because they don't have enough accounting staffing. And then Martin, you shared with me something that Joe Sullivan said about problems just literally on the, with dealing with state taxing authorities, that they don't have the right people. So this is a huge problem that I think we need to think a little bit broadly, in part because of measurement issues for the success of this program, to realize that the more trained accountants broadly we put out, the more in some way we're helping the profession. So I'm going to stop right there. And I'd like to hear just from others where you think we are, what are our goals, and are we still good with that $1 million ask? Because that's the number we've been working with.
Well, I guess I come at it from a slightly different approach. I still look at it and say, what does the board want us to do? We're just a committee of the board.
Yeah.
So if we're trying, our objective, as we developed back in February, is to establish a scholarship stream of excess Board of Accountancy funds aimed to increase the enrollment. That's our charge. The rest of it is up to the board to come up with the rest of the information, in my opinion, based on the committee as it's defined right now, including what is the ultimate goal, what is success somewhere down the line. That's not what we've got that we're supposed to be getting. I would say we're supposed to get that from the board.
Yeah.
But we're to establish the scholarship stream based on our committee objectives.
Yeah. Elizabeth, if I may take that on for a minute.
Yeah.
I just want to confirm for folks that I did have that conversation with Joe, both today and actually initially already a couple of weeks ago, based on some of the earlier conversations I had with Scott. And I can confirm that the board in work session on Thursday will have exactly that discussion. And I think you will be present for that, Elizabeth.
I am. No, and I understand what you're saying, Scott, but we also need to think about this as we are thinking about what recommendation we're making. So that's why I raised these issues. I mean, this is our level, our point B, 4B, I guess it is on the agenda.
Yeah, which doesn't mean you have to make one, but to the extent that the committee feels like, hey, board, think about this, or we would like you to do X, right? It's always a little bit of a chicken and an egg thing when it comes to kind of committees and board stuff, because sometimes there are scenarios where it's really helpful for a board to get a recommendation. Other times it can be better for the board to kind of set a framework first and then say to a committee, hey, here's the framework. Now you fill in the blanks. Right here, we've had it go a little bit both ways, but I think this is pretty healthy, for us to have a discussion here about thoughts from the committee, have a discussion at the board level, and then hopefully we'll have more clarity essentially by somewhere close to 4 p.m. on September 26th.
Because again, we've discussed about of generalized terms, but even again, to that point, when I raised it with U of O, is I use 10% as a number, not knowing what the board would like to see. So that's additional 40 students, and whatever the number is, how many do we want to, again, with the concept being putting people at least into the pipeline. And I realize they're not necessarily coming out on the back end, but 100 people extra a year for 5 years, or is it 20 people a year for the next 5 years? Is it 500 people in the next 2 years? I don't know what the board thinks they would like to see. And to that point of, is it a 10-year process or a 2-year process or a 1-year process? I personally think the board has to tell us that, because they're the ones that control the money. We can help provide some information to them, but it is the public money that they have the responsibility for. And we're a sounding board to help them get there. But I think the committee needs a little more framework of what success is.
So then I could use some help from you, Martin, on this discussion of the specific goals, because I've been moving forward under the assumption that we are going to make a recommendation, a suggestion to the board, and then that will be the starting point for the discussion next week. If I've misunderstood that, please correct me.
No, that's a perfectly valid approach for us to take.
Okay. So then back to that, is there anything I'm missing in terms of the goals that we're thinking about? I just want to try to get, what are our long-term, what are the big goals of what we'd like to achieve? Because that has an impact as well with, if the number is still 1 million, what do we think can be absorbed by the schools? What does the OSCPA think that they can handle? I think that's another piece of it. I mean, I look at that, and OSCPA is doing about, give or take, 100,000 a year in scholarships. And this scholarship, in some ways, the way we are scoping it, is going to, it's going to be both more and less restrictive, because the guidelines are, we're suggesting different guidelines. We're suggesting a lower minimum academic standard. So these are not necessarily just for the very top performing students like OSCPA has been doing. Part-time students can be included. And very importantly, we've said that in order to achieve this goal of diversity, there has to be a focus on financial need. So that's a really interesting question, saying how many students could actually apply for this? I don't know. I mean, everybody feels like they have financial need, but if we're asking them to demonstrate it in some way, those numbers are, I mean, if you just took the percentage of Pell Grant eligible and multiplied it by the 4-year enrollments at the 4-year schools, 2-year enrollments at the 2-year, you could get a ballpark number of students. But there should be a discussion here about an understanding of how much we can absorb. Tana and Sherry, do you have something to add to that?
Certainly, when we talked about this before, one of the things we said that criteria level would be, for example, Pell Grant. That, because we have not been, we're not structured to go through financial need, it's been academically based. I mean, this would be the opposite of that. It doesn't worry me. Tana and I've had talks, discussions about that, but we said there's already a mechanism in place that would indicate need, such as Pell Grant, or maybe we'd say Pell Grant and something else. That makes it a lot easier, because if we were having to set up a whole system on analysis of financial need, et cetera, that's sort of a whole different ballgame. And that's not what we've talked about doing all along anyway. So from the standpoint of kind of going, okay, I'm just going to throw a number out, right? I'll just say 30, let's say we were awarding 30, 40 new scholarships. I mean, Tana, can you remember how many we awarded this year, give or take? I'm trying to remember.
I think it's 60 roughly.
Yeah, that's what I was going to throw out. Thank you, Chris, too. That's what I was going to throw out. So let's just say we had 50% more than we did. That doesn't seem unreasonable. It's some more pages, on what is going out. To me, it would be categorized differently. So we'd have, let's just say, the same number of pages for academic, and then we have half as many pages for financial need. So I don't know if I'm helping to that. I'm not worried about it. Now, if we had to decide who's eligible, because we had to go through all of their financial background, that would be different.
Right. Yeah. And I think the process of the board would just, we have to come up with who will be evaluating or how we evaluate, you know, these applicants versus the current structure.
It would be like two tracks. I would see
Mhm.
that. One would be academic and one would be financial. So, and Logan has his hand up. So.
Sorry, just to excuse myself for that meeting with the fundraiser here. I'll see everybody soon. Thank you.
Thanks, Logan.
Logan.
So just to give you all some perspective on how big our population could be, I just jotted down some numbers. So if you just say, you know, approximately how many students OSU and U of O have, their total accounting majors, and if you just take that Pell Grant eligible, that means the total population of eligible students could be was roughly 60 students at each of those schools. At PSU, it's roughly 240. So we have a potential for, you know, just again, I'm just trying to help us wrap our heads around what this thing could look like. It's hard to get students to apply for scholarships, believe it or not. I have no idea what a yield rate is on applications. Scott?
We have,
So I, based on your Pell Grant eligibility, I think I just heard you say that's a potential 360, 350 people, plus or minus 200 at Portland, 160 at each of, and then I heard from Sherry, I heard that right now there are 60 scholarships being presented. If it's another 50% more, that's 30. So we've got, and I didn't hear you say that's all we could do.
I did not say that's all we can do.
And I'm not saying, so there, but with that being stated, there's that huge gap between 30 people adding 50% of the work to the scholarship of the OSCPA Foundation, granted without having to worry about eligibility, versus 360 as our kind of number. But still within that is how does that filter out to all the other places along the way? And this is exactly the type of conversation I want to have. I'm really one to start getting things to numbers as opposed to thinking of generalities and objectives. That's great, but let's start talking hard numbers. What really are we talking?
And let me be clear, when I throw out 50, okay, let's just say we doubled what we do.
Yeah.
Let's just say if it were, you know, the 60, 65 that we give every year on the academic side, and then we duplicated that on the, I mean, either way, it's a matter of recruiting additional, you know, members to be able to help.
So not only are we talking about trying to find people to apply for the scholarships, we're also talking about trying to get people to participate in the process. So
that does not worry me. People, I mean,
Okay.
it's good work. You know what I mean? I have no worries about the fact that if I'm reaching out to a managing partner and saying, could someone in your firm serve to give away money? That's like,
There's no
easier
problem
ask.
finding people to serve on those committees.
That's
It's an
easier
afternoon's
ask.
work.
That's easier. Yeah, it doesn't go on months and months. So.
You know, and Cynthia, I don't have a sense of your business enrollments. So if you're looking at your business majors, what's a number? You know, I'm working off of PSU's number of about 750 declared accounting majors across 4 years. And what kind of numbers do you guys have?
I'd have to do a little digging. We do have struggles because so many of our students are transfer students, and how
That's
they
right.
are recorded in our system is very confusing because of the broken transfer decree.
I forgot
So,
about that. Thank you for
yeah,
that.
I could look up some ballpark numbers, but we do have a hard time putting our arms around that.
And Claire, your accounting enrollments overall, would you say across the 4 years, what would you give us a ballpark?
I can't really do across 4 years because our students don't declare a major until after their second. So we only have 2 years worth of data.
Right.
We graduate like between 20 and 30 a year would be my ballpark. But it's, for us, there is no accounting major that's declared until after they've taken all of their introductory business courses. They don't
Okay.
declare until their junior year.
Okay, but if we just said take that 30, it's maybe 120. Like if we're trying to just guess, like
At most, if not, you know, maybe that would be on the high end. So 80, 90 would probably be also,
Okay.
you know, but again, don't know until we get there, but I think that's probably a fair estimate.
So going to the numbers then, I mean, maybe when we throw in Southern and PCC and the other smaller schools in the area and the other community colleges, because it is available to all of them, maybe we've got 500 eligible students, 500, 600, 700. I mean, it's not an enormous number. And what kind of a application yield rate would we get? My guess is you might get 20%. Tana, what do you think about that guess?
I think that's pretty close. I was kind of between 10 to 20%.
Yeah.
Mhm.
That's just my gut feel from what I've
Mhm.
seen at PSU and the foundation. Claire?
Just a logistical question for, just make sure I understand. Is there a scenario where there's 30 scholarships to award and there's not 30 applicants? Does that money get rolled into subsequent years? Is that something are we going to use it or lose it each fiscal year type of a situation? I just want to make sure I understand that if we don't have the applicants, is it just mean that there's more money for future humans in the future, in which case then, you know, it's not as big a worry? That makes sense?
That's how the foundation has always done it, right?
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay, so I sort of raised those numbers because I feel like we have been talking a lot about this big picture stuff, and I've been thinking a lot about how does this really drill down into scholarships. So earlier I said, if we were to recommend, because I think this is part of the conversation that's going to happen with the board, is how much of this do you want to go into the first year, second year? Is there some suggestion for an endowment? You know, I think we would be hard pressed to find more than I'm going to throw this number out. If we said 500,000 the first year, if we're trying to, because remember, this is already several years down the road. If we're trying to do 500,000, half of this, if we're making a recommendation, a suggestion to the board as a starting point, 500,000 in the first year, and we were doing $5,000 scholarships. I did that for the math. It makes it easy. That's 100 scholarships a year. That means you need more than 100 applicants.
And that's 100 more than are currently putting into the process. That's 100
Yes.
additional scholarships.
Yeah.
100 scholarships just from this stream. I think that's pretty aggressive. I don't think that could be achieved in the first year. I'm just going to be really honest. I just don't think you're going to find 100 people that apply for this that fill out the application all the way. Sorry, this is not coming across very nice, but it's just experience. This is what happens.
Yeah.
I think we're going to have a soft launch because we're going to be late because we can't do it. You know, we can do the back end stuff, but there's no publicity that we can do until it's approved, right?
It's going to be the same people that have trouble filling out the renewal form.
Exactly.
They don't take the time sometimes.
Okay, where I'm trying to go with this is to deal with this level set committee goals and $1 million budget ask. So we are asking for $1 million, right? That's the number. And
That's correct.
that's for Mark and mostly, yeah. And so then the question is, does the board want us to give them a recommendation? My understanding was they did, about how much of this should be going more towards current use scholarships versus an endowment, which will throw off funds in perpetuity. So, I mean, if we were trying to use this whole $1 million in 1 year, that's not going to happen. It's just, there aren't going to be enough. I don't think there's going to be enough eligible applicants. So I'd love to hear folks' thoughts on that.
Personally, I think it should be, there could be some initial upfront heavier funding, my belief. But I do believe it should be a long-term, close to an endowment type situation. Because it's not a short-term fix until a lot of other variables, for example, the things you brought up, Elizabeth, also come into play. But to think that we can fix what we are calling the pipeline problem with a 2-year infusion of accounting students, I think is very short-sighted.
Yeah.
Is going to happen. So while we may turbocharge it up front, my opinion, I think it should be a long-term 10-year minimum type timeframe that we're looking at these scholarships to be doled out from the money that's come from the BOA surplus funds.
Claire?
So I'm not sure what the foundation's investment and spend policy is, but assuming it's something like 5% of endowment, if we were to recommend that the full amount be endowed, we'd be looking at a $50,000 spin off annually, which at $5,000 would be 10 extra scholarships per year. So then the question is, it allows us to in perpetuity give 10 additional scholarships per year, but it's also not going to be any kind of an immediate infusion. It's 10 students across all the universities. So it's maybe 1 or 2 students per, if any. So I think I like the idea of having some of the funds preserved, but just without knowing what the board's, what the foundation's spend policy is, the actual, operationalization of this would be a relatively small number if we're looking at a $5,000 scholarship. So just wanted to throw that out there.
And I did just sort of pick that number randomly. I mean, it's a number that covers a full year's tuition at PCC, pretty close to it, right? Right, Cynthia? Whoops, you're muted.
Chris.
I was
Chris,
just
can I-
looking for a PCC number. Sorry, could you repeat that last?
I believe that 5,000 would come close to covering a full year's tuition full-time at PCC, right?
Yes.
Yeah, so I just sort of threw that number out as a way of trying to benchmark this, but that may not be a number that, and ultimately, I don't know, is this us or OSCPA that makes that decision?
Yeah.
That's another
Chris
question.
has his, Elizabeth.
Chris has his hand
his hand up.
I'm sorry, Tana, what is the percentage, the spend percentage to address Claire's question?
I think Chris is trying to say.
And then I'll get to Chris. What is the percentage?
I'm sorry, the percentage to spend from the endowments. Well, our investment committee takes a look at it before each year, and it's between 4 to 5 to 6, but
Okay.
pretty much has been 4 or 5%, I think.
And I just realized, Chris, you were probably trying to answer that, weren't you?
Yeah.
So sorry.
No, my question is, do we have any idea what the shortage is in the pipeline right now? We're coming up with a number, but do we know if 10 or 50 students a year is going to put a dent in it, or is too much? Not that it would ever be too much, but
We were, I mean, when I moved here, we were overproducing for the state of Oregon by probably a 30% easily. If it weren't for all those U of O students going back down to California, it would have been a disastrous market. So yeah, there has been situations where we vastly overproduced for Oregon. And that was somewhat a function of how many we were producing and somewhat a function of the size of the economy. As our economy has grown here, we have had a lot more jobs. I don't think we can answer that. I mean, the shortage nationally is staggering. Sherry, were you starting to say something?
Thank you. Jumping back into how much comes in, right? So our contributions come in 2 different manners. So we have folks that are contributing for the current year, right? Not via endowment. So that gives us, if you will, one stream of funds. And then we have the other piece that Tana was mentioning, where our finance committee gets together February. They're looking at what has come through in the investments for the Ed Foundation. So that gives us the other stream. And then so the combined, for example, this year, that's how we end up with. And then if there's anything that didn't get dispersed, for example, that's how, like this year, 107,000, give or take. It's coming in through different sources.
Tana?
Back to, I think you posed the question, Elizabeth, as to whether or not the recommendation of the level or the amount is coming from the board, or would that be a educational foundation piece? Is it possible? Because it almost feels like, well, unless you say we must give away this amount this year, but then if we have a pool of less applicants, could the foundation have the liberty to say we're going to give $10,000 scholarships to these students, and maybe there's a minimum proposal of it must be 5,000? I don't know, just thinking out loud for
I think that's all up for discussion.
Yeah.
Do we need to, I mean, do we need to decide now what those scholarship levels would be? I know we're talking about the $1 million, you know, would we put half of it into an endowment, give away the other half, try to do that quickly, or I'm trying to wrap my head around where's our fence on what we decide for sure?
Sherry, one other piece with that is that how many years do you typically have before you build up your spend account on those endowments? Is that a 3-year buildup? I believe PSU, when they get a new endowment, it's 3 years before it starts paying out, because you have to build up the income on it.
Tony, it seems like it's each one individually, right? Because we're saying an endowment's $50,000.
Right. Once we have an endowment that is funded at the minimum 50,000 level, if they give us 50,000 this year, you know, we would be able to award whatever that percentage is
Okay.
that the investment committee comes up with.
Okay, that's just a slightly different way of doing it than they do at PSU. Okay. And the reason I asked that question is some of what we might want to be thinking about is it sounds like I'm starting to hear that there is an interest in front loading some of this, but thinking about how many years we front load it for, and so forth. Scott?
So we've been dealing right now with $1 million. I know one of the initial conversations was that the separate investment account that the Board of Accountancy has is spinning off a certain amount of money. Now interest rates have started to drop, one would think. Do you know, Martin, can you tell us if the board is still thinking there would be an ongoing contribution from the earnings of the Board of Accountancy separate account into this scholarship fund? I realize there's more mechanics that would have to take place for ongoing appropriations, but is that still a thought?
It's a really good question. And I think what I need to do is kind of level set kind of what's actually in place right now in order to provide the answer. So effectively what happened is, and I hope this gives you, especially on the call here, Mark, kind of a version of positive PTSD from the 2015 session where all of this went through, right? But in essence, what happened is the board does not actually have a separate investment account. What happened is that in the 2015 legislation, language was introduced in our statutes off the top of my head, or as 673-475 was rewritten, and essentially converted the boards. Essentially, that's the language that says, essentially that says that's typical for regulatory boards at first, which is that, hey, that all the incomes all the incoming money gets deposited into the Board of Accountancy fund, and essentially it was set up as a separate fund, a sub-fund by legislation in the Treasury. So what that means is that we don't have a separate fund. Essentially means that literally everything that the board gets in on any given day is all part of that fund, and it's essentially interest accrues literally on a daily basis on that fund, right? So it's not a separate account. It's literally all the board's money is sitting in that one place inside the Treasury, and we essentially get a continual stream of simply interest-based revenue on that fund. So we don't make any investment decisions. It's not invested separately anywhere. It's just this ongoing fund where we basically know that dependent on the interest rate environment, which is, as you all know, starting to change, and the level of, the account balance is what will basically drive how much money is in there. Mm-hmm. So that's the mechanics of it. But inside Scott's question around the mechanics is also the question that I think I heard from Scott just now of, has the board made a decision on some type of ongoing funding stream beyond the original one-time investment, right? And the short answer to that is no, right? What we know from a budget perspective here, and this is the second mechanics piece I want to introduce, and I know it's a little noodly, but important for the committee to know in terms of what is the structure going forward. What's the legislation, the proposed legislation? This is the ledge concept that we didn't get to earlier, and we might as well actually just basically use this as a way to cover this. If you look at the language in your materials of what actually is, essentially came out of the process of crafting this legislative concept, there are two things that are going on here as takeaways for this committee. One is that the way this legislation is crafted is that it does not have to be repeated. Now, what do I mean by that is if the board chooses to make in a future budget cycle a contribution to accounting scholarships, there is no more need for a piece of legislation to flow through the legislature. What the board would need to do is essentially make it a request in its agency request budget to fund that line item. Now, there's a technical term, Mark, you may remember what the technical term is. I'm struggling to remember it right now, but essentially the way that Daz explained this to me is that what this legislation would trigger is essentially a line item that would be permanently built into the board's budget and that would permanently reset to start at zero for every budget biennia, unless a request is made by the board that is then approved in the budget process. So what's happening right now is that one piece is that the legislation to establish the authority to even engage in this type of funding is going through the process. That's a one-time deal, creating that authority on a permanent basis. Separately, there is a policy option package in the board's request budget for that $1 million amount, essentially set up as the fiscal impact right now for this piece of legislation that will be created out of this LC 0298 that you have in your packet, right? Now let's assume for a moment that the heavens open up and the sun shines and all of that stuff gets approved. What it means is that it creates essentially a $1 million line item in the board's budget for 25-27 that we can spend at any time during 25-27, and I'll get to the timelines in a moment. The important piece is that it resets automatically to zero, beginning with the 27-29 biennium, and it would be incumbent upon the board to make a decision to essentially refund this. So that the board will have to have a discussion around, and right now we're not there yet, around does it actually want to permanently kind of commit itself to doing this, or is it going to want to do this on a more, let's see what our fiscal position is any given cycle before we decide to throw essentially additional revenue in there. And then if they do, essentially it can come from any revenue source. It could come from any revenue source, including but not limited to interest money. Now, obviously, if you were to use income from interest, right, it gives you a bit of an argument that you're not actually directly using income from licensee funds to directly fund this stuff. It gives you a bit of an argument that you're essentially solely using revenue from interest on the board's ending balance. So not a separate account, but basically on the board's ending on the board's ending balance to do this. And I know, Mark, you raised a technical question that you may need to remind me of on email that I wanted to also briefly cover while I'm in the midst of all of this. But first, let me get to the timeline piece in all of this, right? And I think that overlaps with your question, Mark, right? So let's go back to the heavens, you know, the things look good for us, the heavens open, we get a budget through that gives that $1 million appropriation. That appropriation essentially is available to the board beginning July 1 of 2025, all right? Now, the way this legislation was written, it was very deliberately run, not just through specialty counsel at the Department of Justice on the tax side, it was also run through specialty counsel on the procurement side. And one of the questions that was in there that was specifically asked and answered is this going to subject us to a procurement process, which was a really significant issue for us, because if it had, it would have significantly potentially complicated and delayed the timing around all of this, right? So short answer is we took care of this, and the way this is done does not subject it to the procurement process. Essentially, the board has the ability to essentially contract without going through that, without going through the procurement process. Please don't ask me for the exact legal reason why, but that was essentially the high level answer that we got. What it does mean is that once the budget gets through, I think timing wise, no later than the September 2025 board meeting, does the board need to essentially take action or make a decision, right, around really getting this going, because I need to get paperwork through the process to actually disperse this as quickly as possible over to the contractor, right? Which I think, Mark, answers your question, because essentially the goal is to try to get this out of the reach of the board and over to the contractor no later than hopefully October or November of 2025, so that two things happen, right? One is the happy thought of, hey, we have a contractor that's ready to go and ready to, as we just heard I think from Tanya, from Tana and others, that once the funding is actually sitting over there, there's nothing that then prevents the contractor from using the money, right? There's no run-up period, right? The other thing that gets closer, I think, to the concern you raised with me, Mark, of how long does this stay within the, you know, potential ability of the legislature to change its mind and try to grab, you know, essentially, potentially, you know, sweep this money if it were to change its mind. And short answer is that the goal and the intent is to get this transfer done before the short session of 2026. So I hope that answers questions so far, but I hope that helps.
So in terms of timeline, Sherry, if the $1 million, focusing on that, if that is transferred in say October, November of 2025, could scholarships be issued out of that and process developed to provide scholarships for the next academic year?
And this is where we've talked about getting a jump start on setting a lot of those parameters in place, but go ahead.
Yeah, and that's actually, I'm so glad you just asked this question, because the missing link here is you have to have two ingredients. One is the money, at the risk of stating the obvious, right? But the other one is a finished and existing contract where for OSCPA, the only issue then is to actually implement it, right? And that's the other timing issue that I failed to mention clearly, which is it really means effectively that by the time you would have your September board meeting, which hopefully like this year would be just before the board's September board meeting, but now talking 2025, that essentially the running goal in terms of getting our contracts work done, that we are comfortable with making sure that we can have a final approval in place, both OSCPA side as well as board side by the end of September 2025.
Because then Tana moves in through the fall process, so I'll just talk late fall, Tana, for round numbers. Late fall, before holidays, that's where all the information starts going out to students about what's available. Now, some of that could shift a little bit and, you know, be a little bit later, but then we have to know also all of that and things, folks are going across, you know, different semesters. And then we move into that February timeframe where we're looking at how much is coming in. If we want to back out a little bit, just one thought though, this is where our board of directors is aware of this, and it's just a little piece of minutia, but staff work for the society, which is under governance by the board of directors. This falls under the Ed Foundation.
Yes, I'm sorry, Chris, my apologies.
That's
I keep forgetting that there is a separate entity that has to go through this, that has a different meeting schedule than the OSCPA board. My apologies.
We have no problem with scheduling meetings to give away money. So, let me say it that way. You know, and so with that, I don't see that there would be a problem with that either. And again, we already have that framework in place that the OSCPA board is familiar with this. The Ed Foundation has said, yes, we would accept this. So, you know, we have some devil details on contract, but that's not a problem. And the contracts usually flow through the staff side.
So with this timeline we've just described there, for students starting in fall of 2026, there could be money going to those folks from this scholarship stream.
25.
That's correct.
The foundation
Yes.
would get, the foundation would get in fall of 25.
Yes.
They start fall of 26. The
Yes.
foundation would be in a position to have all the procedures in place, the vetting of the candidates.
Yep.
Accepting applications, which may be the more difficult piece, is getting the knowledge out there that they can apply for. But anyways, in theory, money could start flowing out in 26.
And that's what we talked about, that awarding would be a year after the legislative session. So basically, sorry, I don't even know why I paused to do the math because I know better.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
So
Yes,
I'm just
awarding.
glancing at the time and it is 12:09. And so wanting to be sure that, you know, this has been really, I think, really necessary to lay a lot of groundwork. But I think that what we were really aiming for, Martin, correct me if I'm wrong, is to have some information to bring back to the board for next week. And I think really some of those critical pieces are of this $1 million, since Mark says that this is what we're really still looking at. How much of it do we want to recommend as a starting point for discussion for the board to be pushed out more quickly to jumpstart this program? Again, remembering we're already 2 years down the road before this money hits students' hands. And then how much of it would be in an endowment. And so that's really the first thing I think that is a really critical feature. And then this second one goes to our agenda item of specific goals and outcomes. I think, you know, in looking at the Washington contract, one of the things that they don't talk about in there is tracking in the same way that we have been talking about it in this committee. And so a conversation from this board around what the request is for tracking on the part of the OSCPA Ed Foundation. And I can envision that as being, you know, really just setting up a nice system of a short annual survey, you know, collecting a quote permanent non-school address from a student and then having a process of surveying every year, because ultimately with some of these students, this might be a 10-year survey process.
Yeah.
Not
And I want
unrealistic.
to just, I'm so sorry, Elizabeth, sorry, I didn't want to talk over you.
Yeah, go ahead.
I want to just add a very important reminder to the committee that as we get into the tracking discussion and crafting kind of what's reasonable, kind of where's that happy spot between what would be reasonable in terms of what the OSCPA Education Foundation / staff could do and what it is that we would like to see inside all of this is a key component that comes straight from the governor's office, because the governor's office, as excited as they are about us going down this road, they've been very clear from the get-go that they really want to see as much as is reasonably possible, data-wise, tracking-wise, what the impact is of, you know, these investments that are getting made specifically from an pipeline impact, diversity impact, equity impact, so on. And I know that some of that might be a little bit challenging in terms of how we could track some of this stuff data-wise, but I know that at minimum, we're going to need to have some really robust conversations about what's feasible on that end, because there will be an accountability structure. This is, and quite frankly, this isn't just about us, just in general, Oregon government under this governor is being run in a much more tight, much more accountable framework that, quite frankly, we haven't had in decades, and it's actually super refreshing. So this isn't unique to this conversation about this board. There's a whole kind of framework that's kind of changed for state agencies of all sizes, including the little ones that they sometimes forget about, like us. But we're not forgotten, either with respect to this piece. In fact, we know, and if I haven't mentioned it to this committee, my apologies, the governor has personally told my policy advisor that she's personally excited about what we're doing here. So we got some very, very nice feedback around this stuff. But I want to just, you know, we need to go beyond the flowers that are coming from the governor's office to the ask that's behind it, which is really around, they want us to do the best job possible of tracking outcomes and being able to say something meaningful about, this is how we impacted the pipeline. This is how we think we impacted the diversity of the pipeline.
I'm not disagreeing with any of that. I do want to ask a question. So in the Board of Accountancy's data for licensees, do you track ethnicity?
I do not believe so.
So
I think we gather it as part of our.
Okay.
I'm looking at Erica because she sees the applications with a little bit more of an intentional eye. And I don't think we ask for that data.
Yeah, on the society side, we do ask for that data of our members. So I'm just kind of giving you a heads up. Not everybody will complete the information. So just.
But when you say society side, do you mean society side?
On the OS.
Or do you mean as part of your process in the Education Foundation?
What I'm trying to say here is on the OSCPA database for OSCPA membership. Not talking about, we're not asking that on the Ed Foundation side. But what I'm setting a tone for is just that heads up that we may not get 100% response on that because people don't always, I mean, we see that with our database. People don't always want to complete that information.
And I want to be really clear.
Yes.
The ask here is not just about, you know, is not necessarily limited to race and ethnicity.
No, I understand that.
You know, there are diversity impacts that go far beyond. It's like rural, urban, it's needs-based, not needs-based. You know, this is, there's all kinds of angles to all of this.
That makes sense.
So I sort of had a short list of things that I was hoping we could accomplish today. And going back to that idea of tracking goals, I think that's a really big piece that probably we'll need to do in a subgroup here.
Yeah.
But as a general understanding from going back again to what we talked about earlier on this committee was there's two pieces to that. We can demonstrate how our students, how the students receiving this from each of the schools differ from the larger population of accounting students at that school. So for example, are we, are we giving money to a greater number of underrepresented minorities, of student parents, of people from rural areas, of first-gen college students? So those points all need to be, whatever we think we have available at our school to describe the population, we need to mirror in the application at the OSCPA. So we can say this is representative, more represented, you know, there's a greater proportion overrepresented, underrepresented on these different characteristics. That gives us an immediate measurement of who received the scholarships. Then there's the longer term tracking that I would envision would be that email tracking that is going to have a low response rate. And so there may be some need for some supplemental reporting of individuals who received the scholarships compared to the Oregon Board of Accountancy database. But this is stuff that gets really in the weeds, and I don't really think we have time for that today. I just really wanted there to be an understanding and perhaps see if we can have agreement on a subcommittee for that. It seems like that might need to be include all of the university representatives, because we're the ones who can go back to our schools and say, what does that data look like? I know what that data looks like at my school because I get it. But we would need Mary, Claire, Cynthia, and Logan to all be able to go back and say, let's make sure that the data that we are asking for in the scholarship application is also available at the school, because we're trying to show relative to our existing populations. Make sense?
Yes.
Okay. So that's one piece that I wanted to get out there with the contract. I know we have the contract here, so we were talking about maybe seeing what else we could do on the contract, but we still have to circle back to what I think is our big bugaboo that we've been dancing around is what do we think about with endowment versus current use? I'm going to throw something out as a starting point, and I'm certainly not saying this is what I think it has to be. But what if we were looking at 500,000 as an endowment and 500,000 of spend over the first 2 years? And if it doesn't get spent because there aren't enough applicants, that's fine. It can roll into the third year, but with a goal of, if there are sufficient applicants, this 500,000 over the first 2 years, because that could be about 100 scholarships minimum. I can't imagine doing too much bigger than a $500,000 scholarship, but starting point. Claire, thank you for jumping in.
I was just going to ask, on average, again, for just context, what is the average scholarship awarded by the foundation for academic scholarships? Is 5,000 about the level that's typically awarded? Is that just so that just to have some context, if that's something you can share?
Go ahead, Tana.
So we have sort of levels. The average scholarship really is 2,500 for undergrads, and we try to award 5,000 to graduate students, but those are a little less, definitely.
Mark?
Well, I guess the number 500 seems a little bit off to me, because I mean, if you're going to go 250,000 for 2 years and then all of a sudden you're going earnings on 500,000, now you're going from 500,000 a year to what, 25,000. So I'm almost thinking 60-40 and spend that 4,000 over like a 4-year period. That would be my thing, because then I think the whole goal for me, from what I'm thinking, is you want to get students through the program. Don't just get them started and then, chop off their knees. So that would be mine.
Mary?
I agree as well. I think we need more in the endowment and spread it out over more time, because we want to keep the pipeline going. It's not just a hard hit to begin with. We want to keep it going over time.
Madam Chair.
So does that, yeah, go ahead.
But I guess one thing we need to consider here is we also want to keep people in the pipeline once they're in it. So are we talking about, we are intending to fund this person who receives a scholarship in year 1 through the 4 years or 5 years they're going through a degree program? So I guess we don't want to fund them for 1 year and then you're on your own after that. So we are talking about a full 4 to 5 years potentially that we're funding them at the $5,000, which does help with our tracking. We can see who renews their scholarship requests. So that helps with the tracking process. But I think we need to think of in terms of not just 1 year, but when we give them that first year, we kind of want to commit for another 3 to 4 years after that.
Does that
Unless they're not coming in until later in the process and they only have like 2 or 3 years.
Well, then, you're correct, yeah, through the, whatever they are in their academic career. And then the second year we start this process, we're gonna have another person that they are a freshman that year. We've got 4 to 5 years with them at that point then too.
And something for food for thought for later, not to get off on a tangent, but would you give priority to someone that's received already once a second time? So I want to just throw that out there.
Mary and then Claire. Oops, sorry, Mark. I mean, Scott. Why do I keep doing that?
No, go ahead.
Like the idea of, you know, continue through to help them, because we do have students drop out and that could be a problem. We would have to factor that in though, as far as what's, you know, how much money we're giving away. And I also like the idea of giving preference, you know, so long as they are declared accounting, you know. So it's easier tracking, but we're also giving each student a larger amount over time. Maybe we cap it and say, okay, you can do 3 years. We'll give you 3 years and you're on your own for that. I don't know. Just throwing that out there.
Claire?
So what I was going to say is that along those lines, I like the idea of making it available to students so that it's not just a one-off. And then we need to think about looking at the actual numbers, that if we give X number of scholarships in year 1 and all of those students are going to come back in years 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, by the time we get to year 3, if we're spending $25,000 off an endowment, there's not enough money even to fund the ones who were funded in the first place. So if it becomes a 4-year process, then we have to make sure that we're able to do that. And if that is the case, and we spend if all of the spend is used to fund repeat students, then there are no new students added to the pipeline until that first cohort or second cohort graduates, which then, you know, puts us in a place where we're not feeding the pipeline with new students. We're just supporting the same group of 20 or 30 or 10 or whatever it is for their 4-year education before we can go back and do this all over again. Does that make sense? So I think that I want to be mindful that if we're thinking about endowing a good portion of this, the spend of 5% is not going to be anywhere compared with the amount that's going to be given the first year, which would make it difficult even just to continue supporting that first group of students through their 4-year education.
And I don't know if that 5,000 that I randomly threw out was a reasonable number or not. I mean, you know, just from the 3 major schools and UP, we're graduating about 340 students a year. So if the governor's office is looking for a high percentage to be increased, I mean, that to measure the percentage increase in graduates is just, there's too many variables. It's so messy. You can't tease out what's this versus anything else. So, but again, just thinking 340 a year, you know, how many are we aiming for?
Maybe it ends up being a blend too. Meaning there are some students, like there's a certain number of scholarships that would be awarded the second time or whatever, but others are new.
All right, so I heard Scott throw out 400, 600. Was that you, Scott, who said 400, 600, or was that somebody else?
Throw out as what?
400 for current spend over 4 years and
Oh.
600 for an endowment, maybe. I know I saw Claire nod at that. I would just like to bring something as a starting point to the board. I think I think that they are not so immersed in this conversation. I think, am I right, Martin, that they're looking for a recommendation from us?
It certainly will be helpful, but no matter what, whether they get a recommendation or not, they know that they need to kind of come up with direction.
Yep. Okay. Claire?
So just crunching numbers and hoping that I did it correctly. If we were to do that, say $100,000 for a year, if we stick with a $5,000 scholarship, that's 20 students. Endowing $600,000 at a 5% spend gives you $30,000 a year to spend after that. It would then mean 1,500 per student per year for the remainder of their college education if those 20 were to be funded again. So it drops from a 5,000 one year to 1,500, 1,500, 1,500, and then there is no space to add anybody new until somebody doesn't apply again or they graduate. And if somebody applies new when we're spending off the endowment, then they're going to not get that 5,000 start. So my thought is that from a long-term standpoint, I might even think about putting a little bit more into the endowment just because it allows us, you know, in perpetuity to be able to feed the pipeline versus a one-shot infusion of students and then it's over and done with. But just as we start to crunch numbers, the amount that we could give to each student in subsequent years, once we get to the point where we're spending off the endowment, is significantly less if we have, you know, even 20 students with the numbers that you just threw out.
Cynthia?
I was kind of going through the same calculations that Claire was, and I was dawning on me that we might have to be more careful in the number of scholarships in the first year. So that's another factor too.
Well, maybe
Yeah.
the 5,000 is too high. You know, I mean, again, I'm kind of, you know, some of these are going to be part-time students as well. But the thing that's sticky with this is some of these part-time students may become full-time students if they get extra funding. And that's a non-trivial thing to speed up somebody who's already in the pipeline. Because I mean, PSU, we have students, it takes them 8 years. 1 to 2 classes a term. Hannah?
So I just did a rough calculation. If you were talking of using 400,000 in the first, or, you know, to spend, but over the 4 years. So that would, you know, if we break that down to 100,000 annually, then if you went with 25 applicants, that would be 4,000 a scholarship.
Mm-hmm.
So maybe it almost feels like the board may need to come with a proposal of, you know, capping it or something, whatever those numbers end up, but that might be the way to look at it.
Mark?
And I'm going to say too, going back with what Kamala just said, is if the full million goes over and we say, okay, spend 100,000, now you've got 300,000 that's going to be earning for, you know, so I mean, you're kind of endowing, but you're saying, you know, we're going to spend this over a little bit more period. So you throw some future value on that 100,000 a year. You're not going to get, I don't think, to the point where, you know, 600,000 is going to give you, you know, 100,000 a year, but you can have some time to build up the program. And, you know, I guess hopefully at some point, if the board continues to do well, and, you know, we don't know what interest rates are going to do right now, they could throw a little bit more money, like say into a current year scholarship. So, you know, so you are kind of having a pipeline. It's just not a fire hose, it's a garden hose.
Claire?
So if the goal was, you know, something like 100,000 a year, then we'd be looking at needing to have a $2 million endowment at a 5% spend. So then the question is, since the board doesn't know whether or not any additional funds are going to be put into this pool of money, like, is over that 4-year period that we're spending the $100,000, can the board or somebody else come up with an additional 1.4 million to get to the point where then you can spend that 100 a year? Or is there going to be, again, a really steep cliff after that first 4 years? And I don't know the answer to that question, if it's possible to raise additional funds to subsidize, you know, or to build up the endowment to reach the level where we can then maintain a constant 100,000, 75,000, whatever it is per year that's being given in scholarships, then I think that's great. I just don't know what can be done in the 4-year period to get it to that point.
Scott?
Madam Chair. So, okay, using our example of 100,000, and maybe we've already moved beyond that, of $100,000, The first year is 100,000, the second year is 200,000, the third year is 300,000, the fourth year is 400,000, if we're trying to continue to fund those people through their education. So in that 4-year period, we've burned up the $1 million right there. So again, it's not just funding them for 1 year, it's funding them for 4, maybe even 5 years. So I think we need to really scale back on the number of students and the scholarship, unless we want to basically spin it in 4 years and call it good.
Logan, to
And-
get you up to speed, we're talking about, you know, how's this, what kind of recommendations are we going to come to the board with about how this should be allocated between current spend and within the current spend over how many years and how much should be endowed? And we've also raised the issue, it seems to be a lot of agreement here that we should be thinking about this as once a student gets a scholarship, there is at least some priority to that student continuing with the scholarship. It's not going to be 100% because some students are going to not continue in the major.
That's great.
Chris?
Awesome.
We might also consider maybe just funding junior and senior year and graduate school if necessary. Very rarely, here at Linfield, very rarely do students show up the first day of school knowing they're going to study accounting. Sometimes that takes a year or two for them to figure it out.
We had talked about, but this also needs to go to community colleges.
Yeah.
And the community colleges are so critical because that's where our students that fit the criteria for this come from. That's why I shared those Pell Grant and racial statistics. Cynthia?
And I just add to that, community college students are often coming, urban community college students are often coming to us with a lot of plans already formed. They're a little bit older and a little different than the 18-year-old.
And I don't think it's unreasonable to say there's a different dollar amount for a community college versus a four-year university because community college tuition is about half, give or take, of the four-year institutions, four-year public institutions. So that also, depending upon, we have no idea what the mix is going to be of applicants and recipients. That can change drastically how many recipients we have. Yeah, just as a benchmark, 70% of PSU accounting majors come in through community colleges. The majority, and half of those are PCC. Logan, did you want to add something? I feel like I cut you off.
Oh, no. I think the one thing I'd say about the spending timeline, and Martin might have already discussed this. I gathered from the board that moving quickly is on their minds. And so in terms of spending, that might mean spending more early on, conditional on capacity.
Cynthia? Sorry, I was just reading Mark's comment.
Yeah. I just really want to sit down with a spreadsheet, as I'm sure we all do, and start trying to pen this out. But one thing I start thinking about is maybe this in perpetuity is holding us back too much. And maybe if we were setting a timeline like 10 years, how would that move the dial for diversity and increasing the pipeline? I'm just throwing that number out. I'm not saying that that's the number that may help us figure this out a little bit better.
And I will.
Martin and Scott?
No, go ahead.
No, go ahead, Martin.
So I just want to point out that while it's true that in terms of what the board needs to grapple with and what this committee can grapple with is right now limited to what the actual ask was in the budget process for the $1 million, right? But I forget who said it here earlier. I believe it was Cynthia. The real issue, the issue beyond that is either would the board have capacity to add more later on, or someone here, and maybe it was actually Claire who said it. Maybe it's also another source, right? And it brings me back to the potentially inappropriate in a sense of outside my bailiwick comment. That I'm consciously making with OSCPA and Chris sitting here, right? But there is that whole other potential that essentially OSCPA and the Ed Foundation could also consider on their end, quite frankly, taking this kind of one-time event as a way to do a fundraising, saying, hey, do we want to turn this into a matching campaign? And do we want to do other things, essentially more on the private sector side, that could further increase the funnel that could come, into the foundation? So that's a decision that OSCPA and the Ed Foundation need to make. That's on their end. What the board can take on is, hey, how do we, do we want to supplement this at some point down the line? Right now, I think the furthest we got at the board level is that the board was a bit nervous about committing, something, in a future budget cycle until we know exactly what until we know more about what our fiscal position is, that cycle. But we've set up very deliberately a framework where the board can make a budget ask without having to go back through a legislative process. There's a budget process, but not a legislative process.
Scott?
So I opened the conversation earlier when I said the idea of a front-loaded endowment, if you will. But as we sat here and had the conversations and started putting dollars to it, I very much am stepping back from the idea of an endowment if we want it to be meaningful. Again, considering the idea this could be a 4-year stream for each individual, or maybe even 5-year income stream for each individual, that we could be looking at a case where the spend is going to be over a 5 or 6 year period. And so I would back away from the endowment piece perhaps entirely, because again, there's an arithmetic increase, geometric increase of the dollars that we're talking about as each year new people come in, and we continue to potentially fund those that is scholarship for. So I'm stepping away from my comment that maybe it should be endowed.
Okay, so I started this, I said, I'm just throwing out a number, 50-50. 500,000 up front and then an endowment. So it sounds like you're moving away from that. I mean, I think you're right. The numbers, playing with the numbers is really critical here. Claire?
So just in terms of impact, I'm on the board of a national foundation, and we also grant scholarships, and something that we talk a lot about is it better to give one student across their college career $20,000, or is it better to give, 10 students $2,000? So is maximum impact based on being able to fully, or not fully fund, but to really materially subsidize one student into the profession, or is it that we get 10 students started in the profession to try and just in terms of just raw volume by numbers? And so I don't have an answer to that. That's a philosophical question. I don't know, maybe the board has a take or somebody else has a take, but in terms of pipeline, if we're just looking at numbers, then how do we serve the maximum number of people versus we've got someone that's going to be $5,000 a year for 4 years and they've taken $20,000 of this, as opposed to, again, 10 people getting 2,000 each, or whatever the number works out to be.
Scott?
Well, to that point, again, if we're looking at it in terms then of Pell Grant eligibility, we're talking about folks that need funding for more than one term. So I hear your point, Claire, but I guess if we're using that as our criteria is I think we would be focused more on trying to keep them in the pipeline, than getting them in the door, getting them hooked in that first year, but then not providing additional funding. They're going to have the same financial resource shortage that they had as a freshman or as a sophomore. So they're really going to need our support. So I totally get what you're saying, but I think I would say let's focus more on getting a person in and keeping them there through the end. It'd be great if we could bring even more people and they get hooked and somehow they find additional financing. But again, I don't think that's going to how it's going to play out. So I guess I would be more focused, investing heavily in the one person all the way through their career, based on the criteria we're already using for how they're going to get scholarships in the first place.
Cynthia? And then I'm going to ask Logan to kind of share some thoughts since he has the board perspective on this.
At Portland Community College, we've had quite a few years initiative of say yes to equitable student success. And the key, the picture that they always show us is this is our students coming in. Equitable success is this. keeping them to the end. And I think that would be always my goal. If you want to change who's at the end right here, you have to do this. And so I would advocate for that model.
That's really helpful, Cynthia. That image is very powerful. Logan, what are you thinking as you're hearing this?
So in terms of the board's guidance, I think all like our discussion last time, and Martin, you can tell me if I'm saying too much or too little, is the board seemed interested in things going quickly. But beyond that, I think that's pretty much all I can say about the pace of disbursement from the board. Martin, how would you say that?
That's a perfect summary, and that's also one of the reasons why it's coming back to the board on Thursday, a week from now, because we know that that's not, sufficient in terms of providing a framework. But I think your summary in terms of how far we've gotten so far is accurate, right? I think very much a sentiment toward quick, but not a lot of structure around that. And I think that if the committee is willing to provide a recommendation around what structure it would deem, at least a good starting point for the board's discussion, I think that would really help.
Claire?
So again, these dynamic numbers, because some students won't need 4 years of funding and maybe 5,000 is not the number, but just 1 million divided by 5,000 or divided by 20,000, if we fund them for 4 years, is 50. So it would be 50 total students and the money's gone into the pipeline. And maybe that's the outcome that is preferred by the board, and that's the outcome that we look to have, is to hopefully have 50 new accountants in the pipeline, and then hope that there's a good budget year and we get to come back and do this all over again at some point in the future. But just again, throwing numbers out, and if the preference is to fund them meaningfully for potentially 4 years, then we're going to, and any kind of endowment would basically mean we could fund like 2 people a year, or 3 or 4, whatever it is, in perpetuity, or we fund 50 with the $1 million and then we're done. So I don't, and again, I don't know what the right answer is. Philosophically, I think I can see, Cynthia, your point about getting them all the way through is really important. And I think in terms of the pipeline and having enough people in the profession, I can see the argument that we need a lot of people. So I don't know, but I just want for us to keep in mind that if we're looking at 5,000 a year for 4 years, then we have 50 students and full stop, and that's it, without extra funding.
I want to bring up one other possibility is it builds a little on what Claire was saying about the number of students. We might be limited in the number of qualified applicants, right? Making this law. Yes. Maybe we've already talked about this, but I'm curious, like maybe Sherry could provide some insight on this. Is how oversubscribed is the current OSCPA scholarship process? I think it's not, right? So we could talk all day about how much we want to spend, but it could be that there's X candidates incremental that we can actually, grant a scholarship to, and that might be an artificial limit.
I think you were already gone, Logan, when I just said, let's throw out a number by looking at the percent of Pell eligible students at the major schools and the number of declared majors they have. And I think we're looking at a number of probably 400 eligible students. PCCs is sticky to figure out, but that's eligible students. So what do we think a yield rate is on scholarships? And I had the number 20%. Tana was thinking 10 to 20% of eligible students might apply. So maybe we're looking at 50 applicants a year. I don't know. I think this is a big unknown, but I do think, and all of this is so helpful, because what it all comes back to is, I do believe that the board's going to have to say something about, because we're going to need this in the contract. How much of this is current spend, current meaning, not endowed, over how long, and how much of it is endowment. And I don't think that your board has all the nitty gritty on this. That's what I'm trying to take that off their plate. So again, looking at time, we're at 12:45. I'm going to ask if there's something that we can do, Martin. We've been throwing some numbers around that are pretty back of the envelope, back of the napkin. because they don't incorporate for example, continued interest on the funds that are not spent. If one of the folks on our committee was willing to take a first stab at creating a couple of spreadsheets or a couple of scenarios in a spreadsheet that are a little more granular, are we allowed to in some way work through that as a committee without having a public meeting? I mean, how do we do that where it doesn't become problematic for public meetings? I'd love to have something where I could say, look, here's just two scenarios. You know, this endowment versus current spend and that one, and just put some assumptions in there and give that to the board. Because I'm thinking if I was a board member, Logan, that might be really helpful to me.
That sounds great.
Yeah.
We don't
So
have our,
Martin, how can we do that without getting into public meeting, without breaching public meeting laws?
we don't have our attorney on hand today, but Martin, can you channel Angela maybe?
That's a really good one. What are we precisely trying to do outside?
So if somebody on the committee, because I know if we start having two people do something, it becomes problematic. But if somebody on the committee was willing to put together a spreadsheet with two different potential scenarios of endowment versus current spend, and kind of show with the assumptions of X dollars of scholarships, this results in so many scholarships. Again, making that assumption, I think, about potentially funding, it's not going to be 100% of the students for 4 years, but making some assumptions so that we can show the board, these are some things we've been playing with. This is different scenarios of how these funds could be spent and potential impact in terms of numbers and timeline of providing the funding. I think if we go to the board, we're not going to get anywhere if we go to the board with this level of conversation. I think they're going to need more detail. And my concern is that I want to have board input on this spreadsheet and don't know how to do that within public meeting laws.
Yeah, so there's two ways that can happen, right? And one will make you happy and the other one will not. The happy way first, right? You can go as far as saying, here is what the committee would like someone, whoever it is, committee member, to do, and essentially delegate to that committee member, you do something on the spreadsheet and you bring it to the board, i.e. we don't develop the spreadsheet as a committee, it's simply one person will be delegated to bring something specific to the board. But the moment we get to trying to have conversations as a committee as to how to edit that spreadsheet, how this and that is the other problem, if we get into a substantive discussion, we need to do that in a public meeting. Okay, so if it's a delegation route, we don't have to have a public meeting, because then simply somebody says, okay, I heard enough here, I'm gonna put this on a spreadsheet and I'm gonna bring that to the board. But if the idea is for us to develop what's on the spreadsheet, we do need to do it in a public meeting context.
Here's an option, and tell me if this works. The delegate prepares it, submits it to you. You in turn distribute it out for the committee to look at for comments back to you only. Does that work?
It's gathering from a group.
There's a specific legal term that's used in public meeting law that's called, it sounds a little weird, but it's a real term called serial communication. The first time I heard it, I thought they were talking about serial killers. It turned out not to be quite that dramatic, but it is kind of the term that they use on the legal side in public meetings law for serial communication. And that's, I think, effectively would get us really, really close to that. This is quite frankly, for me, a super sensitive topic. The only thing I'm prepared to say in a public meeting is that right now there appear to be significant changes to how public meeting law is being interpreted in the works, including from whom, and I'm still trying to reorient myself in a changing landscape. And that's about as far as I will go in a public meeting.
The other question is, when's the board meeting? The 26th?
Next Thursday.
Next Thursday. So to the extent that anybody's drafting this up, with or without then other committee inputs, it's got to be done here fairly quickly to provide that data at the next board meeting.
Yeah.
Right.
So that's another hindrance to a input from a lot of people. Let's put it that
I
way.
just didn't want one person to do this, was my whole concern. This is the kind of thing we want two people's eyes and two people's input at a minimum.
Yep.
Yeah, and so that's the super sensitive part for me, and I will simply say at a super high level, given the changed environment that we have entered, if less than a quorum of this committee work together
So we're back
on
to that.
developing something, then it appears to now have blessing from those that have stepped in to provide guidance from a public meeting standpoint.
So
Which is different from guidance that we have received previously from a different body of Oregon government.
Okay, so I'm sorry, in plain English, are two of us allowed to work on this?
So 2 people is fine.
That's all I need to know.
It wasn't 4 weeks ago, but it's apparently now.
Are there 2 people who would like to volunteer to work on this? I don't envision this being very problematic. Awesome. Scott, we got number 1. Who's
Scott
number
has
2?
gotten us 50% to the goal.
Well, actually, the committee we could have more than 2.
We can have more than
A
2.
non-quorum could
2
be
or
just
3.
3.
I'm just trying to make it easy. And we can work via email on this.
So I guess what I would say is I've got an idea, I think, of putting together a spreadsheet
Yeah.
that I then could submit to Martin and then the other person, or Martin then submits to that other person for that second set of eyes along the way.
Yeah.
I saw
again, it's
Claire's
gotta be
hand
done.
go up. I would like to add myself to the process if that's okay, because I'm going to be presenting this to the board. So how
Okay.
about the 3 of us? Is anybody feeling left out? Because I think we can't go to 4.
So
So
who's the
in my
3? Scott, Elizabeth, and who else?
Claire.
And Claire. Awesome. Okay.
Okay, so I just want to be clear that what it is we're going to do. We're going to do a couple of and see if anybody else has any critical points that they want incorporated into this. Probably 2 scenarios. I mean, I think we don't need to go overboard. Is that okay, Logan?
Yeah.
I mean, the idea is just give them a feel, but we'll give them our assumptions of wanting to have some perpetuity, but also providing greater than a year's worth of funding and for that equitable success, because we want them to get all the way through. We're probably on our assumptions looking at somewhere in the neighborhood of $4,000 to $5,000 per student. We're working off the full $1 million, and we'll probably run a couple of scenarios with, I don't know, maybe we do it at 500, and it sounds like nobody is advocating for more than 500 to go into the endowment. Am I correct? We might even go lower. Is there anybody, I'll ask that question more clearly, is anybody advocating for more than 500 to go into the endowment? Based on our conversation, Mary?
Yeah, I think we should have more going in there because we want more interest later.
Well, but did you catch what Logan was saying? The board wants to front load more.
Yeah, I do. I understand that, but I don't know that 500 is the right number. I like the 60-40 at least.
Okay, so maybe we do 60-40 and 40-60 and see what those look like.
Yeah.
And I think some of that we won't know until we start getting everything into the spreadsheet. I think that's a big piece of it, because you know what we're talking about is raw numbers, ignoring any interest during the time period.
And
Claire?
real quick to clarify the move quickly forward position, yes, but front loading, those seem really similar, but that's not necessarily the board's position. It may be.
Okay, thank you. All right, Claire, and then Cynthia.
Just in terms of timeline, to make sure I understand, and Logan or Martin probably would be the ones to answer this, is the board looking to make a final decision about what the recommendation is and vote on the 26th at that meeting, or is it this is the starting point and then we would come back if we needed to and discuss more, like how final is their decision, and or when do they need to make whatever final decision they're going to make?
So my understanding from the conversations that I had with Joe is that this will be the first opportunity for the board to have a much more detailed discussion around goals and framework. I didn't see it. I did not hear from him that he views that as the be all and the end all of, this is the end. I think this is a pretty complex conversation. So I just think this is really the first really hard shot that the board will have to get into the details. But I didn't hear anything that that led me to believe that this is the one and only shot that the board will take at this conversation.
Cynthia?
I might have missed this. You were talking about a partial endowment. Can we also look at if we just go for spend, how many years we could make this work for?
Sure.
I started to do that. I was surprised I got out to 6 years pretty easy.
I think we can do that. That's 3 scenarios. I mean, pretty much once we build the model, it's pretty easy to do this, right?
Yeah. Great. Thank you.
Okay. I think this is great. All right. So big piece of that is we need to specify the assumptions. So the 3 of us are allowed to email to just the 3 of us on this. Just want to be sure I'm not. Okay. Fantastic. So I have got another meeting as well the rest of the day, but I am happy to start the email around with the 3 of us unless somebody else has, because we're on a tight timeline, unless somebody else has time this afternoon. I'm happy to start it after my meeting. Is that okay?
When you question is one who's going to be part of the emails, you're going to start the conversation or you're going to start the spreadsheet?
I was going to just I've been taking notes on all the assumptions that we need to make on this. So how about I start with that? I thought you said you kind of already have in your head doing the spreadsheet for this.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Again, aspirational thoughts are very different than finished product.
Yeah. We all know how that works. But I just wanted to, I've just been taking notes on these, so I thought might be, I don't know if anybody else was, but I also thought in that, part of that is a lot of that background data. I think just somebody glancing at the numbers of graduates and Pell Grant and underrepresented minorities, that is really eye-opening when you have those numbers in front of you. And I think that needs to be given to the board so that they can just understand the scope of what we're potentially talking about. So that's why I thought I would start with giving you guys that. And then if Scott, if you can take the next step and start building a spreadsheet and we can just circulate. And I mean, I'm happy to, as much as I hate the Google platform, I'm happy to work in that if, it makes it faster for the 3 of us to be working together.
So Martin, the board meeting is Thursday. What's the drop dead date for you to have it in order to get it distributed to board members for advance notice?
The advance notice,
or
okay,
not?
So Logan, this is going to sound a little bit harsh. I don't mean it to come off as harsh. Advance notice only applies with respect to noticing the meeting itself. There's nothing that legally or process-wise prohibits me from giving board members something with as little as 10 seconds notice.
So it could be delivered on, Elizabeth could be delivering it for the very first time when she attends the board meeting on Thursday.
I don't want to do that. I would like to be able to give that to them on Wednesday. How's that? If the meeting is on Thursday?
I think it's always better if there is at least a little bit of leeway for folks to
as a board member, I totally agree with that. Yes.
So, just because I can give something to a board member, literally in the moment, walk into a meeting and saying, sorry, I couldn't get this to you, it's not necessarily the best idea.
Let's make a goal for the 3 of us to have this by Tuesday evening. Fair?
Sure.
I know it's Friday, but this is not a huge thing to put together if the 3 of us work together. I don't think this, and we're just making assumptions. We can say $4,000 scholarship, not making the distinctions between maybe what is needed for community college versus 4-year. Undergrad, it's just, I think I'm realizing through all of this, there's a big board education piece that is going to be needed because they don't have a ton of, they have 1 academic on that board. And they don't, and we're lucky that Logan has by merit, because he's not just an academic, because he's a director, he pays attention to what goes on at all the other schools. Not everybody does that. So again, you know, each person tends to be focused on whatever their alma mater or the school that they're most involved with. So I think that's a big education piece that needs to happen in here.
Well, with that stated, and I make sure the spreadsheet I'm thinking of that I'm whipping up is merely to indicate how the dollars themselves work along the way. In terms, without all the other influences, just simply if we said this amount for this many people, and we're gonna fund them for 4 years, we burn the money out after 5.5 years, whatever it is, including earnings or whatever it is. So it's what I've envisioned is just simply how the numbers themselves work. There's all this other context that the board needs to know, but I don't know how in my mind, I'm not sure I would build that into a spreadsheet. It's just purely the numbers.
No, it is just purely the numbers, but I think that understanding of how many students could potentially be eligible, what kind of scholarship application rates do we think we're going to see? I think that's the benchmark that they need to be starting with, and that's what I was going to pull together.
Okay,
perfect.
And
Hey,
Scott, one more thing.
I know we're at time, but I've just, because you brought up education, I want to just very briefly bring to your attention and the committee members' attention that I've been able to work behind the scenes with my dear colleague Sherry here, and we actually have a November 8th town hall that's supposed to be focused on what the board's legislative proposals are for the 2025 session. So I do think that there will be a portion of that where we will at least talk about this in a very public way with the broader CPA community, and we need to get ready for that a little bit too in terms of what our messaging around that stuff is. I wanted to just at least throw that out there.
OAIA will be involved in that too.
Yes.
Participating that day.
Okay, so we are at 1:02. Are we? I think we need to adjourn here. So I believe I don't need a second for this. So meeting adjourned at 1:02.
Okay, stop recording.
All right,
There we
thank you
go.
very
Okay, thank you all, appreciate it.
much to look at that.